I rise today to address an issue that I know this body will be dealing with in much greater detail in the coming weeks and months, and that is financial re-regulation. Mr. President, on Monday, I'm introducing legislation to establish a Systemic Risk Council. I've worked with Chairman Dodd on this issue and his staff, and I'm very grateful that his discussion draft, though I haven't seen the specific language, is expected to include a strong Systemic Risk Oversight Council, which I've been advocating. I appreciate Chairman Dodd's leadership on this issue and look forward to working with him and the administration on making it a reality. As I've articulated previously here on the floor and in an opinion piece published in the Washington Post, we need to establish a framework for addressing systemic risk in our financial system. Systemic risk isn't the only area, of course, we need to address, but is an area in which the current system has unequivocally failed. Systemic risk is actually a number of risks, united by the possibility that if left uncontrolled, they could have consequences for the entire markets or the entire economy. We saw examples of that a year ago. Most often, systemic risk comes from the failure of an important financial institution, but because that is not the only source, we should not expect to control systemic risks with a rigid, one-size-fits-all approach. In order to do this, we need a body that can look across our financial system at all sources of risk, that can spot gaps or opportunities for firms to avoid regulation, and that will not be consumed by other day-to-day responsibilities or protecting its own regulatory turf. Some have proposed that the Federal Reserve serve as the systemic risk regulator, but its monetary policy responsibilities present potential conflicts, and it has proven incapable of properly regulating large institutions. The Federal Reserve claims to be the systemic risk regulator at the moment, but it has obviously failed to take on that task, and we need to be careful in balancing its responsibilities and authorities in coming years. Mr. President, that is why, if we want to ensure that monetary policy and systemic risk are each managed in the best possible manner, we must recognize that institutional structures and responsibilities do matter. Doubling down on a structure of the past that has not performed well outside of its core function is not how we should confront the challenges of the future. Our founding fathers opposed concentrations of power and favored a system of checks and balances. We have resisted creating an all-powerful central bank, and a council would allow for such a system of checks and balances. The Federal Reserve is, of course, not the only agency that has not performed well in the crisis of the last year or so. The current system has failed to provide proper checks and balances and has replaced healthy competition where effective and innovative firms flourish with a system where a handful of firms are too large to fail, can threaten the safety of the entire system, and enjoy an implicit, or maybe even more explicit now, government guarantee that destroys any notion of market competition. This failure points to another task we must take on in financial regulatory modernization. We must end the notion of too big to fail. That's why I believe we should establish a strong Systemic Risk Oversight Council, and I'll be introducing legislation, as I mentioned, to do just that. A Systemic Risk Council is not a silver bullet, but avoids the pitfalls of entrusting systemic risk responsibility with one single agency that has other missions, and that those other missions could serve as a conflict of interest. A council can see across the horizon and have all the information and expertise flow up into it. And it addresses our stovepipe problems and avoids the conflicts that come from also conducting monetary policy and helps to stave off regulatory capture. The Systemic Risk Oversight Council I propose would consist of the Treasury Secretary, of course the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, they would play a valuable role, and the heads of the major financial regulatory agencies, and two independent members, including the chair of the council itself. This chair of the council would be independently appointed by the President. It would be charged with the responsibility for working to improve our understanding and control of systemic risks. This builds on the model of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. In that entity, an independent chair appointed by the President and approved by Congress and supported by a permanent staff has proven to be relatively effective and ends up resembling the National Transportation Safety Board or the National Security Council. Critics of this approach have said that you cannot convene a committee to put out a fire. But we do convene committees to prepare for and to respond to large-scale crises time and again across our whole system. Experience has taught us that boards and councils can work in a wide range of contexts, provided they have the right responsibilities, powers, and membership. Even the Federal Reserve and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation are run by boards. In addition, I believe we should leave the real emergency power with the regulators. The Federal Reserve should retain its 13(3) authority, and though it should be tightened up, bank regulators should retain prompt and corrective action authority, and the FDIC should retain its resolution powers. Matter of fact, Senator Corker and I have introduced legislation already that expands the FDIC's resolution powers to include bank holding companies. In a crisis, however, the Council should coordinate all of these regulators and their actions, just as police, fire, and emergency response all coordinate in local emergencies. But the Systemic Risk Council cannot be just a debating society, so it would have real resources and power. First, in addition to gathering and analyzing data, the Council could help to determine how to regulate new products and markets in order to minimize regulatory gaps. Those regulatory gaps often ended up with regulatory arbitrage, as we've seen recently. It would first identify gaps in the system, and then have the appropriate regulators work together to fill these gaps. With these tools, we eliminate the huge blind spots our regulators have had last fall, when new and unregulated markets tailspinned out of control. We will also eliminate the ability of firms to avoid regulation or to find the weakest regulator by ensuring consistent treatment of activities across the financial markets. Second, in order to address the too big to fail issue, the Council will work to prevent firms from becoming too large to fail. It would do this, I would propose, in 3 specific areas. First, it would have the authority to identify large firms that could pose systemic risk if they failed, but do not currently have an end-to-end prudential regulator, and would assign them a federal regulator. This can include hedge funds, insurance companies, or other non-bank financial companies. Making sure that those companies that have no regulatory oversight, if they fall into this category of too big to fail, have some type of oversight is terribly important. Second, the Council would establish system-wide prudential standards for large firms, including counterparty exposure limits, increased capital requirements, reduced leverage and strengthened risk management requirements, all to make sure that while we wouldn't set an arbitrary cap on size, we'd make, as a firm gets too large or takes on too much excessive risk, there are additional requirements put on it, such as additional capital and others that I've outlined. Finally, it would work with the Council. To ensure that any firm could fail safely. We saw in the past that there was no plan on how we would unwind a Lehman or an AIG. Making sure to work with the financial regulators, the day-to-day prudential regulators, to develop clear written plans for the unwinding or failure of a financial company. In a sense, we'd be asking some of these too big to fail institutions to pre-approve or put forward their own funeral plans or dissolution plans so we would know how we would go through this process should that unfortunate event take place. These plans would be made in advance of trouble and could not reply, and then consequently we'd make sure they would not reply on the type of government intervention we were forced into last fall. Mr. President, as I've said, the Systemic Risk Council is not a silver bullet. Many systemic risks already lie squarely within the responsibility of our day-to-day financial regulators, our prudential regulators. We need to make sure that our current regulators, though, have clear missions, including managing risks within their regulated institutions and markets. And we must ensure that these regulators do their jobs. But that's only half of the answer, because other systemic risks lay outside of a day-to-day prudential regulator's job descriptions, in between the cracks of our existing regulatory system. The Systemic Risk Council's responsibilities would be clear and focused. Systemic risk would be its only job and would help fill in the cracks and prevent problems from becoming unmanageably large or complex. Mr. President, what I'm proposing today boils down to a simple, consistent, and I believe common sense idea. If we want to do something constructive about systemic risk, we should create a mechanism that can both ensure that our regulators do their jobs, avoid conflicts of interest, and fully leverage our existing regulatory resources to prevent to promote the proactive identification and control of systemic risks. By having this council made up of the heads of the day-to-day prudential regulators, the Fed, the Treasury, and these independent members, this independent chair appointed by the President, I believe we create this mechanism. We need to make sure that we never again put the American taxpayer in the kind of financial duress that we had take place last year. I believe the Systemic Risk Council approach, working as one piece of an overall financial modernization and re-regulation, will head us in that direction.